Hello, and welcome to On the Marie Curie Couch, the podcast that aims to break down taboos and start open, honest conversations about death and dying. I'm Jason Davidson. I'm a social worker by profession, and I've worked in palliative care, hospice care, and bereavement support services for more than a decade. Each episode, we speak to a well-known guest to find out about how they feel about their own mortality and how their personal experience of bereavement has shaped the way they live their life. Today, I'm hosting a very special episode of On the Marie Curie Couch, released as part of the National Day of Reflection on the 23rd of March. A day for us to come together as a country to reflect on the loss we faced during this past year. In this episode, you'll hear from 8 of the guests who've joined me on the Marie Curie Couch since the podcast first began in November 2019. We've chosen some of the most memorable moments from the podcast to remind us just how important it is to talk about and reflect on our grief. Our first guest was Adam Buxton, a comedian and fellow podcaster. And as with all our guests, I began by asking Adam to tell us about a significant death he'd experienced in his life.
Well, I suppose the main one would be the death of my father, Nigel Buxton, also known as Bad Dad, when he was on our TV show, the TV show I used to do with my friend Joe Cornish. And he was a part of that. He was like our youth correspondent, even though he was in his 70s. So he was an important figure in my life for all sorts of reasons. He was my dad, but then he kind of reinvented himself as this person who was helping me out professionally with the TV show, and then that kind of reinvigorated our relationship. And then I didn't see him for a long time. Like his last sort of 15 years, he kind of took himself off. He and my mum had split up. He was living out in Sussex in a little house near the Downs where he used to go walking. And then he was quite old when he was diagnosed. He must have been about 90, I suppose, when he was diagnosed with cancer. And it quickly became clear that it was not really treatable. And so the decision was made that he would come and live with us. When I say us, me, my wife, and my children, and my dog, beautiful dog, out in Norfolk, in the countryside where we live. We're lucky to have a house that's big enough for us to, have room to put up my dad. So he lived with us for what turned out to be the last 9 months of his life. And he died in November 2015, the very end of November. He didn't get to see Brexit and Trump get in, which I'm happy about. Well, I don't know. He might have liked Trump.
Could we just go back a bit, Adam, and back to the time your dad moved out of his house?
Yes.
And moved in with you and your family. What was that like, the move and those kind of initial few weeks?
It was stressful. I don't think I'd ever considered the idea that he would actually come and live with us. He'd always joked about it. When he would come and visit, he would say, "Oh, you've got all this space out here. You're so lucky. Maybe I'll come and live out here sometime when I'm a bit older." Well, yeah, whatever. You could turn that shed over there into a very nice flat. That'd be good for me. Sure, yeah. And then when he actually got ill, I thought, actually, maybe that would be a good idea. I mean, I checked what his prognosis was, obviously. If they were giving him 10 years, there was no way I would have moved him in. I'm joking. But, I mean, there was an element of that. It was so sudden. They suddenly said, my sister called up and said, "We've just been to the doc and they're talking about might be a year, might be 3 months. So it's like, whoa, okay. Emergency. Let's get him in. So I did have a conversation with my wife, although she will possibly dispute that. This is the thing. If anyone listening has ever been in this situation and you have looked after a parent or a loved one, I mean, there's all sorts of repercussions and bits of shrapnel that go off in your life, and your routines and your relationships are tested in ways that you never really considered, and that was certainly the case with us. But yeah, it was massively disruptive, but I was looking forward to it. I felt sort of good to get the opportunity to be a more dutiful son, you know? I think I felt guilty for not having seen him more than I had, which wasn't really my fault because he wasn't too, you know, we'd invite him over and stuff, but he was quite happy keeping himself to himself. And so when he got ill and he moved in, I said, all right, Dad, look, let's get you over. We're gonna fix up the little guest area, and you can move all your stuff in. We can store it in the sheds, and this is going to be good. I imagined that it was going to be the beginning of a kind of very cathartic bonding session, tie up a lifetime of loose ends, ask him a load of questions that I'd never had the opportunity to ask before, because he was he was 91 when he died. You know, he was from a very different generation, very kind of formal, conservative in every sense of the word, pretty uptight, not a big one for talking about his feelings at all. So I thought that the fact that we were looking after him and he was vulnerable, I thought maybe that would encourage him to be a bit more open, and we'd make a more meaningful connection than we ever had. That didn't happen. Instead, it was just all the bullshit that comes with making all the arrangements that have to be made, you know, getting everything straight with the district nurses and the local GP and doing all that admin, you know, and going to the local doc and finding out, getting all these bits and pieces of nutritional supplements that he now needs to take and all this kind of stuff. And that suddenly becomes the routine. So yeah, it was not what I expected at all, and he wasn't really up for. There was an initial couple of weeks after he moved in that was now I can see the honeymoon period, when he was very grateful and very emotional about being with us. You know, he was scared, and he was really happy that he was with us. He'd always loved the place that we live, you know. And always loved my family, and even Rosie the dog. He was never a dog person, but he made an exception for Rosie. So initially it looked really like it was going to be great. But then the routine sets in and real life kicks in, and you've got your own responsibilities as well. You know, you have to carry on working and taking the children to school and putting out the bins and all that stuff.
Really honest words from Adam there about the challenges of caring for a parent who has a terminal illness. Having conversations with loved ones about death and dying can, of course, be difficult. But for those who do manage to speak about it, it can be very helpful. I spoke to singer, actress and writer Beverley Knight about her best friend Tyrone and the sort of conversations they were able to have prior to his death.
We talked about it a lot because we had to face certain realities. I mean, it's going to come to all of us, but in Tyrone's case, the possibility of it being much nearer was, you know, obvious due to the nature of what was wrong with him. And so we actually talked about things like the funeral. Not so much the quote boring bits, you know, the paperwork and things like that. That we didn't really go into so much. I wish we had. That's a whole nother story. But we talked about the day he would like, you know, the kind of funeral he would like. And the first thing he said was, well, you've got to sing. And I was like, really? Really? You expect me to stand there and be together enough to sing? Okay, then. Well, we'll see. You won't see, but we'll see, you know. And I did. God knows how, but I did. And we talked about, you know, details, flowers, you know, who's going to be a pallbearer, what kind of a after, wake, whatever they call it, he was going to have, and those kinds of things. Those are the things that, because he could have a measure of control over it, he wanted to tell me, this is what I want, this is what I don't want. He didn't want it to be too maudlin. I said, well, look, you're a larger than life personality. People are going to miss you. I'm going to miss you, It won't necessarily be maudlin, but there will be sadness. You can't eradicate that. And he was like, yes, well, I want it to be fabulous. And, that's how he was. He was just so gregarious and larger than life. He was a wonderful, wonderful man.
And actually, what a great, I think that focusing on that stuff,
yeah,
the kind of colourful stuff,
yeah, and it was colourful, yeah,
is that that's the bit that's going to be sort of representing him, isn't it? It's going to be part of him and who he was.
Exactly. Exactly.
That's the bit to kind of celebrate and remember.
That was the side that mattered most, because the other stuff, who is the executor of a will, and and
equally as important,
but my God, drier than the Sahara. So of course I had to deal with all of those things. He had family, but he was a big gay character, and his HIV status was not something that he talked about at all. I only found out really about it by accident, because I couldn't get hold of him, and then found him in the Chelsea Westminster Hospital. And I looked around the ward, and the posters talking about CD4 and, white blood cell counts and all of this. I was like, okay then. Nothing changed between us. I just had more knowledge, and with knowledge is power. So, but his family, it was difficult for them to understand his sexuality. Conservative Jamaican background, such as myself as well. That comes with a whole set of problems. On top of that, the stigma of HIV, it was difficult. So his family were around at the very end. That's when they kind of were back in his life, and that was great comfort to him. But getting back to what we were saying, I was the person who was the executor of the will, so I had his passport. I had the not so fun job of having to inform council, Mr. Tyrone Jameson is no longer with us, and death certificates.
Did anyone advise you about kind of what to do, or did you just figure it out? About having a will or contacting the council.
Tyrone, when they talk about executor of will, it's a title, it's a phrase that is chucked around. But Tyrone was 31. He didn't have a will. He was even though he knew that his and HIV back then, different antiretroviral drugs. It wasn't like we have it now. Thank God, things are so much better. But back then it was tough for him, even though he knew the day of his mortality was coming. It just, he just hadn't planned that side. So when it did come, I'm lucky because Tyrone was practically adopted into my family. We just had him. Here's an extra brother, So my family were absolutely brilliant and helped me to do everything. Get all his affairs sorted out and get everything in order. I was not in a good place. I was a absolute mess. But my family were just rock solid, and everybody pulled together and really helped. Well, we helped each other through it because we all were feeling the loss keenly, but in terms of the practicalities, the family really helped me through, because I had no clue. Not a clue. I knew you needed a death certificate, but I didn't know any of the steps, any of it. I was entirely clueless.
Thanks to Beverley for sharing what was clearly such a difficult time. Back in 2019, I spoke to Oscar-winning filmmaker Dustin Lance Black about his mum and his experience of bereavement. I asked him the advice he'd give to someone who's grieving.
A lot of people ask me advice as they start to lose loved ones nowadays. I get, and these are friends, but also just strangers who have read Mama's Boy, kind of know, what I've experienced. And I say, never underestimate the tremendous power, and it may be the most powerful thing a human being can do, which is to be there. I don't care what you say. In fact, saying nothing can be quite powerful. Be there. Be there next to the person who is dying. Be there. If you can hold their hand, if that's fine by you and them, wonderful. If you can sing to them, terrific. If you can get them drunk on Crown Royal and play punk rock music like I did for my brother in the minutes he was dying, fan-fucking-tastic. But be there. And then when you're with people who are in grief and mourning, and you don't know what to say or to do, be there. Oh, the power of bringing someone a warm tea when they're in grief.
So many people describe how, we'll have people talking about neighbours crossing the road because they don't know what to say. Or family members not making contact with people because they don't know what to say. Friends even as well. So these sort of separations happen at this time when, as you're describing, what's most important is that you're just there. You don't need to say anything. Sometimes practical things can help as well. Can you do some shopping? Can you go get some milk and some bread?
Oatmeal cookies. Put me on the sugar train in grief.
Lance, what's helped you?
I don't know. I still wake up all of the time wondering where my world has gone and not recognizing the world around me. And I could not be more fortunate to have this new life in this new country with a wonderful husband and now a 14-month-old son. And, I'm rebuilding. But I'd be lying if I said I often wake up and I don't recognize where I am. And I think some of that, will continue to get sorted out. I think what's helped me in some ways is the reconnection with my mother's family. I challenged myself on the other side of my mom passing away. I said to myself, if my mother had in her life shown the courage to come to L.A. and meet my gay friends and to see if she couldn't build a very unexpected bridge, shouldn't I show courage to go the other direction and to go back to Texarkana, to Texas, to Louisiana, and to reconnect with my family there? But could we connect? Is there a higher plane than politics? Are these relationships, these familial and community relationships, worth fighting for? That was what my mother left me with. And so I did go back and I have reconnected with my family. And we don't agree on everything. We're edging towards acceptance of each other. And so, that gives me some strength. That helps.
Yeah, there's something very powerful in that, I think, isn't there? That link, even if you're not getting along.
But, you talked about how neighbors and friends and coworkers will cross the street. And some literally do and others do it in other ways. Others you just don't hear from for a while. And I don't want to make it seem like this is easy. And one of the things that's very much not easy about it is that it draws into question for you and probably everyone around you and who knew your loved one or knew what they meant to you, their own mortality. And for some people, that's very scary. they don't want to get too close to death because then they have to admit to themselves that they're not immortal, that we're all dying. And so it forces us to face and accept something that's very difficult for many, if not most people, about this beautiful thing called life and existence, which is how ephemeral it is, how much we are all whispers.
I found Lance's words really powerful and put so eloquently. Also in 2019, I spoke to Blue Peter legend and author Janet Ellis, who at the time was trying to make sense of her husband John's terminal cancer diagnosis. As part of our conversation, I also asked Janet her thoughts on whether legacy was important to her.
It's a funny one, that, isn't it? Because I suppose in some ways I've got the opportunity for something solid left behind, two books, some old bits of tape, but that really isn't about how I think of myself, and it isn't. No, I don't know. I certainly don't think it's about solid, chunky legacy of things I have done. But I'd like people to just think that I did it okay, really. Looked after people okay, was mostly kind where I should have been, picked up litter. I'd like to be remembered for that because I'm really keen on that. And that I didn't take it too seriously. But on the other hand, I am, like I said, overwhelmed by what people are capable of. But I'm still super aware of how fragile all this is, how unpredictable. And I try and get a sense of something like joy from it when you get past the anger and the grief, that there is still an amazing sunset somewhere. I don't mean to sound like a Clinton's card here, but I think I have to think like that now, because otherwise the temptation to just hide away initially was so great that I would not have been able to have anything like this conversation, because I was paralysed by a kind of anger which had no end point. Couldn't even be angry at anything. Wasn't even there. Couldn't focus. Couldn't have a row back. I mean, John doesn't have rows with me. I have rows at him sometimes, but he's really bad at the other page of script. And with this one, it was even worse, because there was nothing. Talk about howling into the absolute ether. Nothing back.
Just before we finish, is there any maybe practical tips or advice you might give to somebody listening who is maybe going through something similar to you and John, or is maybe grieving?
You're not on your own. You really are not on your own. And there will be somebody there who understands in the way that you want them to. Marie Curie obviously is an amazing place for people to explore how they might feel about dealing with it. I think sometimes grieving is like being in a room that you think is sealed, and actually you can't see it. It's built into the wall, but there is a handle and there is a room next door, and beyond that somewhere else that you might find more comfortable. It isn't a time-limited process. I always think that's really important for people, that grief can catch you unawares years and years later, and equally it can leave you for a moment when you think you might feel it most. And all of that, I think, is fine. But there will be somebody to support you, somebody unlikely. And I think one of the things that's revealed with what's happened with John is that some people that unexpectedly have been extraordinary about helping us deal with this. And we do need help. For all our, we don't want to tell anyone, we do need help. And John's found that an amazing thing, that some people are just sensitive in a way we didn't expect, or empathetic in a way we couldn't have predicted. But I think, personally, I would say, please don't be alone with this, because in that room there is nothing except you trying to find the door, or hunkered in the middle of it, doubting you'll ever leave. But someone on the other side of it is knocking faintly. Listen hard, you'll find them. Walk towards the sound.
Sadly, Janet's husband John died in July 2020. Our thoughts are with Janet and her family, and we're grateful to her for sharing their story so openly.
The Great Daffodil Appeal means even more to us in 2021 than previous years. Marie Curie nurses have been on the front line of the pandemic, providing vital care. At the same time, we've been unable to fundraise as normal. Please donate what you can. Your support would mean the world to dying people and their loved ones. Visit mariecurie.org.uk/daffodil.
Through our work at Marie Curie, we know that every person's experience of grief is unique. However, people tell us they find it really helpful to hear the experiences of others, and that in turn can help them process their own feelings and also know that they're not alone when it comes to grieving. In March last year, I spoke to the wonderful actress Jane Horrocks, who talked about the death of her father and the pain of feeling orphaned, even though her mum was still alive.
I think the most significant bereavement was my dad, who died 8 years ago. And I didn't think I was that close to my dad. But when he died, it was such a profound moment for me that it's kind of undescribable and very difficult to prepare for, losing a parent. And I think that was quite shocking to me, actually, how devastated I was by losing my dad when I thought I was kind of all right, about him going. But when it happened, it was profound.
So the thought of it beforehand, you thought, well, I'm going to be able to manage this and I feel okay about it. But then when it happened, it was a different story.
Yeah, definitely. My mum, who's got Alzheimer's and is in a nursing home and doesn't really know who I am, is, I don't know how long she's going to last. Mm-hmm. I mean, I didn't know how long my dad was going to last. He ended up in a nursing home as well with Parkinson's and dementia. Doesn't bode well for me, does it? But, it's funny because I feel like I've already lost my mum through Alzheimer's. Mm-hmm. And I kind of feel the same way about my mum, that I think I'm going to be able to cope with it because I already feel like I've lost her anyway. But I know that that's probably not going to be the reality. And there is a certain dread when that day comes, when I am going to lose my mum, and that profound effect happens again, which is so out of your control. And, kind of otherworldly.
Mm-hmm. Some of those losses that come with dementia, which I've heard people talk about before, can you talk a bit about that? A bit about what that is like for your mum and for you?
Well, I think because my dad had Parkinson's and then got dementia, and he didn't last very long with the dementia. And I think I've been living longer with my mum and dementia, right, than I was with my dad. So I think it's really kind of, I've absorbed it a lot more with my mum than I did with my dad. And it was much more of a gradual process with my mum as well, whereas it seemed to be very rapid with my dad. Right. I mean, it's very strange. I often refer to my mum in the past, that she's not alive anymore. So that's a very strange thing. People correct me and say, hang on a minute, I didn't realise your mum had died. And I go, oh, no, she's not. No, gosh, yes, I don't know why I'm speaking of her in the past tense. But it's looking back at videos. I'm in the process of making a little art film about my mum with old footage that I've got of her. And to think that person isn't with me anymore is pretty awful. I kind of have to put up a really strong barrier to deal with it. I'm in the process of moving house as well, and lots of things have changed recently in my life that I've kind of thrown everything up in the air to see how things land. And I think it is a direct result of my mum having Alzheimer's.
Why do you think that is?
I think because the loss of somebody so important in my life is, well, you know, sod it. Why not? Why not just actually take massive risks now? Because that rock that was in my life is no longer there anymore.
And I don't know, but I'm wondering if there's something about both parents as well. So your mum's the second person to go. She's not gone. She hasn't died. She hasn't physically died, but you've lost the mum you remembered, like you were just telling us about, the mum in the video clips. I wonder, I don't know whether there's a link between having both parents and then having none. In
yes.
that chucking everything up in the air
Yes,
thing.
yeah,
You know.
yeah. I mean, I'm in effect, I've been orphaned, yeah. So even though my mum is still alive, I do feel like I am quite an orphan now.
Such powerful, honest words from Jane. Next, we hear from another great British actor, Hugh Grant, about his much-missed mum, Finvola. I asked Hugh what had helped him in the days following his mum's death.
Well, I'm not sure. It's a very strange thing, grief, because in my experience anyway, it hits you at the oddest and most embarrassing times and doesn't hit you at other times when you think it might. For me, it was the certain triggers were pieces of music, because she always played the piano, and particularly when she was tired, and she played a couple of her standard pieces were bits from a ridiculous old 1950s musical called Salad Days, which was her first date with my father in the 50s. And these were the pieces of music that I made the organist play. And they're very jolly, upbeat pieces of music, which was quite odd for as the coffin's being carried out of the church. But that was the bit that set everyone off, including me. That was the saddest. And those pieces of music still have that power now to make me feel quite sad. And then other weird things, you know, just going about in your normal life, chatting about something. My mother had a very strange relationship with our cat. And sometimes my dad still talks to this cat, even though the cat's been dead for many years as well. That can sometimes set me off. Or I think how sad it is that my mum never met my kids. You know, that's sad.
And what helps you? What has helped you at those times?
I just think...
Do you talk about it?
No, not well. Yeah, a bit with my brother and things like that. But I wouldn't say we sort of talk about it too much. It's mainly just keeping. You know, as I keep saying, she had a great sense of humour, and so it's keeping a sort of sense of humour about the whole thing. And you know, it's incredibly bad luck. You get cancer, you die.
I was just thinking about that, you know, because some people do talk about it. Some people do talk about their grief and find that very helpful. Some people can talk about it endlessly. And
it's odd. Some people are completely poleaxed by it. I have a German friend who, his mum died, and really, you know, for 10 years he couldn't think or talk about anything else. It's quite odd. I think it's different. You know, different people react in different ways.
You know, what we know in our work is depending on our relationship with the person, then sometimes our experiences and our grief can be different. Yeah. And it's interesting, they just mentioned your brother, and we know sometimes even in the same family, you know, people will have different relationships even with parents. Yeah. So therefore they'll have a different experience of bereavement and grief. Doesn't mean they can't support each other, of course, but we'll just have a different experience. Yeah.
I think his has been fairly similar to mine. But the person, you know, we're really watching out for all the time is my dad, left on his own. And, trying to make sure he's okay. And, you know, he's old school, sort of ex-army officer. So I think, you know, naked exhibitions of grief quite unlikely to come from him. But I do remember the moment my mum's body was taken out of the house, Dad said, I don't want to see this bit. And he just watched from a window inside. And that was I remember thinking that was interesting that he didn't want to deal with that particular bit. And then I think, it's coming back to me now, one of the things that gets one through those first weeks after death is practicalities, organising a funeral. It's quite helpful. It fills your days. Thinking about, mundane things like what vol au vent should we have at the reception. So I think that helped a bit.
What Hugh highlighted there was how helpful some of the traditional rituals around funerals can be. And that's something that many people have had taken away from them during this past year, making it even harder than ever to grieve. Please do listen out later in the podcast for our support line details if that's something that's affected you. In July 2020, I spoke to MP David Lammy. As so much of our life moved online, my chat with David was via video call. He opened up to me about losing his mum.
I think, the thing is, we were a very spiritual family, and my mother was a very spiritual woman. And, I remember the last time I was with her where she was fully conscious in the hospice. And I said to her, Mum, look, I wanted to just tape you talking about your upbringing in Guyana and about your mother and how you started and what, because we don't talk enough about that. And I think I'm going to write a book down the line, and I really want to get this down. And she talked and she talked. I was so pleased to have captured that conversation, which I did subsequently put into my first book. I captured the conversation, for which I was very grateful. And I remember I said, oh, look, I've got to leave now. And it must have been about 7:30. And she said, will you just help me to the loo? And I helped her to the loo, and then helped her back to her bed. And she said, oh, darling, I was looking at the carpet or something. And she said, I'm seeing double. I think I'm traveling, she called it. And traveling it's used very much in West Indian, African cultures. It's the idea that you're sort of moving towards your ancestors. And she became very emotional. She started to sort of cry, or tears started to roll her eyes, and she started to laugh. And she was very peculiar. But what was clear to me was that my conversation with her had prompted something, pushed her somewhere. Clearly, she started to think about her mother, and that she was close to seeing her mother. And it made her first sort of tears roll down her eyes, but then a sort of laughter. And I have to tell you, if I am in that point, I will be dying at some point, and if someone brings my mother, I'll be the same.
Yeah.
And she said to me, I don't know my mother's sense of humour. She said to me, "Is this what they say LSD feels like?" Is this what they call tripping? She said, in a sort of cheeky way. Anyway, I kissed her goodbye and I left her. And then I remember getting a call early in the morning, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock in the morning from the hospital saying, look, you've got to come now. She's, taken a turn for the worst, and she's definitely into the last stages, round up the family, and you need to come down here. When we got to the hospice, by the way, by this point, it was myself, my brother, sister, aunts and uncles were beginning to gather. She did sort of slip into I suppose it's like a sort of semi-comatose situation as the breathing starts to slow. And it went on for a good 3 days or so, actually. And there was one point where it was only 24 hours before she died that a particular aunt came to visit. And as I say, my mother was in a sort of sober, measured Anglo-Catholic place in terms of her faith. And this particular aunt that came was in an evangelical, almost theatrical place in terms of grief. And she started to sort of holler and scream and carry on when she saw my mother lying there in her bed. She was in a coma by this point. And even then, because my aunt was being so theatrical in displaying her grief, my mother sort of woke momentarily from her coma and said, darling, please don't embarrass me. It's, it's such a lovely hospice. Please lower your tone. And then slip back into this coma and died 24 hours later. So she was absolutely. The other thing she said, and this is, I've seen this also in grief over the years with relatives that have died, she was very grateful that, as she put it, she was dying from the bottom up. So it's also taking those moments to give thanks. So not only did I find with the cancer that we had these 2 years, and we spent a lot of time together, very tight, very special, but also my mother reminded us that she was dying. She said, look, you either die from the head down or the feet up, and I'm dying from the feet up, which means that I'm still here right to the end. It's only when you've been with loved ones, with either Alzheimer's or some cancers, where you haven't been able to connect with them in quite that way, that you realize how special it is, even though you're losing someone, that they're there with you right up until the last. And even as she took her last breath and we were all around her, she was in the room, she was with us, she was wishing us well, she was at peace.
What was your mum's name, David?
Rose.
Rose.
I haven't said her name, and actually just saying her name makes me well up, because I haven't said her name in a long time. Her name was Rosalind, but she was called Rose by her friends and Mary by her family as a sort of family name.
It's so lovely to hear the joy it brings David to say his mum's name out loud. Saying their names and remembering stories about someone who's died can be so important to us. Finally, for this special episode, at the end of last year, I spoke to the wonderful pottery designer, Emma Bridgewater. As with all our podcast guests, I asked Emma how she would like to be remembered.
I don't think it's up to me. I really don't. And I'm bothered by people curating their legacy. I think it leads to HS2. I think the idea that you should, try and control what you're remembered as and for is desperate, really, really desperate. And I feel sorry when people start a charity. I can see how that work and memorializing can be really, really good. But for me, I think you've got to be careful about the levels of distraction that you give yourself. And I would definitely encourage people to donate, perfectly speaking, to Marie Curie. So often your best help in those desperate dog days. So I think sometimes people cut themselves an enormous great task to distract from grief, whereas it might be better to sit with the grief and to encourage, to raise money for an existing charity. I'm not quite sure why I feel that, but I know I do. I suppose it is slightly anti the legacy idea. I think sinking down into the turf is what you do then. I mean, whether you're buried or cremated or whatever, I don't think you matter when you're gone. And I think, well, my grandmother had this thing that she didn't want a gravestone because she felt that they were melancholy. And the churchyard here were very keen that people would know where her grave was. And so the compromise I came up with was a flat stone, sort of, proud from the ground. And I thought, for as long as perhaps, my daughters and their children or whatever are visiting, they can sort of scrape the grass will start to grow over it. They can scrape it back. And then when it's forgotten, when she hasn't got any visitors, it can quietly sink down. And that I feel that straining for immortality means nothing to me. But then I'm the person who's put my name on a lot of cups, some of which, as we know, pottery shards might last a long time. So perhaps I'm talking complete nonsense. But the idea of trying to guide what people think about me after I'm dead, I really don't like it.
Oh yeah, I didn't think about that, how long pottery lasts, the little shards.
Yeah, it's a thought, isn't it? So there you go. I'll be remembered as a fragment of spotty pottery.
Just before we finish off, Emma, Can I ask what it's meant for you to be able to share your story with Marie Curie today?
Well, it's a privilege to have been asked. And exactly like you, I feel keen to encourage people to talk with their friends, with their family, about their feelings about death, whether it's the death of somebody precious who's just died or what might happen after one's own death. I think talk about it, folks. We should all be able to talk more readily about death, bereavement, terminal illness. Otherwise, suddenly in the great sort of sadness and drama of someone's death, you've got to learn the vocabulary all in a rush. And if there is a barrier, if you do feel shy about it, work to break it down. Better to start processing, it's better to start thinking and let what can happen. I think through talking about it, through processing grief, it's possible to find if I think of my daughter and I walking along the Thames, she's still so sad about a death 5 years before. Whereas more recent, my sister's more recent death, I felt I could feel myself processing because of having that imaging. So you want to get from the deep, deep, dark misery to some kind of joyful connection with what that person really was. So the loss starts to just meld into the joy of that life, because it's so awful to live sad. And I think talking about grief can help convert that heart-rending trouble and sadness into a gentle kind of real available joy about the person instead. And achieving that for my aunt and my mum, and I mean, I'm still working on it with my sister, it's very raw, but it feels so worthwhile.
Beautiful words from Emma there about just how important it is to talk openly about death. Thank you to all of the amazing guests who've joined me on the Marie Curie Couch since we started making the podcast. If this is the first time you're listening to the podcast, then don't forget that all of our episodes can be found in full on our website or wherever you get your podcasts. Please do subscribe, as we've got lots more conversations coming soon. So that's all for this special episode of On the Marie Curie Couch, marking the National Day of Reflection. If you know someone who's been bereaved this year, why not reach out to them to let them know you're thinking of them today? Marie Curie's here to help all year round, from planning ahead to coping with bereavement. You can talk through any concerns you have around the end of life with our support line team, which also includes specially trained nurses. Call us on 0800 080 2309 or search Marie Curie online. The podcast is produced and edited by Marie Curie with support from Ultimate Sound and Vision. The music featured is Time Lapse by Pan Oceanic. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family. Thanks for listening, and until next time, goodbye.